She didn't know who saved her that night, and somehow, that made it harder to breathe than the fear of losing everything. The envelope felt heavier than it should have in Emily Carter's trembling hands, the thin paper pressing against her fingertips like it carried more than just a receipt inside. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of scent that clung to low-rent buildings where dreams came second to survival. Her apartment door stood slightly open behind her, the faint hum of a baby monitor crackling from inside, reminding her that time wasn't hers to waste anymore. Just hours ago, she had been sitting on that same worn couch, her 6-year-old son asleep beside her, her phone lighting up with missed calls from her landlord, each one tightening the knot in her chest. 3 months behind on rent. 3 months of choosing between groceries and electricity. 3 months of pretending things would somehow fix themselves. But nothing ever fixed itself. Not in her world. The fluorescent light above her flickered once, twice, casting uneven shadows across the peeling walls as she stared down at the envelope again. Her name was written in clean, steady handwriting. Not printed. Written. Personal. Careful. That alone made her heart beat faster. People didn't write carefully for strangers. Not anymore. Slowly, she slipped a finger under the seal and opened it, her breath catching as the paper inside unfolded with a soft, deliberate sound. A receipt. Paid in full. Every overdue dollar. Every late fee. Every warning notice erased with a single transaction. Emily blinked once, then again, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. Paid. Not postponed. Not negotiated. Paid. Her first instinct wasn't relief. It was confusion. Then suspicion. Because nothing in her life came without strings. Not help. Not kindness. Not even luck. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she scanned it again, searching for something that would make sense of it. A mistake. A wrong unit number. Anything. But it was all there, her name, her apartment, the exact balance she owed down to the last dollar. A soft sound came from inside the apartment, a sleepy murmur from her son, and for a brief second, her chest loosened. He wouldn't be woken up by shouting tonight. No pounding on the door. No eviction notice slipped under it like a quiet threat. Just silence. Just peace. But the feeling didn't last. Because at the bottom of the receipt, just beneath the printed confirmation, was something that didn't belong. A small handwritten note. 2 words. Simple. Clear. Not alone. Emily's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as something colder replaced the brief flicker of relief. Not alone meant no repayment. No expectation. Which somehow felt more dangerous than debt. Her mind raced through every possibility, family, but she had none nearby. Friends, but they were barely getting by themselves. Government assistance didn't work like this. And strangers didn't step in like this without a reason. The hallway suddenly felt too quiet, too still, like the building itself was holding its breath with her. Emily turned the paper over, searching for more, for anything that would explain it. That's when she saw it. A name. Written smaller, almost like an afterthought. But it stood out more than anything else on the page. Daniel Hayes. The letters seemed to blur for a second as her brain tried to process them, to place them somewhere familiar. And then it hit her. Not from her world. Not from overdue bills or part-time shifts. From somewhere else entirely. Billboards. News articles. A name people said with a mix of admiration and distance. Billionaire. CEO. Untouchable. Emily's fingers went cold, the paper slipping slightly as her grip faltered. The air in her lungs felt too thin, like there wasn't enough of it suddenly. Why would someone like him? Her thoughts cut off before they could even form properly, because deep down, she already knew the answer didn't make sense. And that was the part that scared her the most. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't even known where to ask. Yet somehow, someone had seen her. And for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. And she didn't know if that was a miracle or the beginning of something she wasn't ready for. Emily stood there longer than she should have, the paper still trembling in her hand as footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere down the hall, reminding her that the world outside her confusion had not stopped moving, that people still had places to go and lives that made sense, unlike hers in this moment, suspended between relief and something far more unsettling, because help was supposed to feel warm, not like a question she could not answer, and yet the name on that page refused to leave her mind, repeating itself like a quiet echo she could not silence. Daniel Hayes, a man who existed in a world she only ever saw in passing headlines while waiting in line at the grocery store, a man who owned buildings like the one she lived in, not rented apartments inside them. And the idea that someone like him would even know her name felt impossible, let alone pay her rent without a word. Without a reason, without even expecting gratitude, and that thought alone made her chest tighten again, because gratitude required understanding, and she had none to give, only questions that kept multiplying the longer she stood there, until finally she forced herself to move, stepping back into her apartment and closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, as if sealing her into a reality that had quietly shifted while she was not looking. The dim light inside wrapping around her like a fragile shield, the baby monitor still humming gently on the small kitchen counter, and she walked toward it almost instinctively, needing something familiar, something real, glancing at the tiny screen where her son slept curled beneath a faded blanket, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, unaware of how close everything had come to falling apart just hours ago, unaware that a stranger had stepped into their lives without knocking, and for a moment Emily pressed her fingers lightly against the counter, grounding herself in the present, in the quiet, in the simple fact that tonight he would sleep without interruption, and that should have been enough. It should have filled her with relief, but instead it left her with a deeper unease, because she had not earned this, had not fought for it the way she fought for everything else, and that absence of struggle felt wrong in a way she could not explain. Like missing a step on a staircase she had climbed her entire life, and her eyes drifted back to the paper still in her hand, to the name written there, and she tried to recall every moment of the past few days, every person she had spoken to, every glance exchanged, searching for something that might connect her to him, but there was nothing, only long shifts at the diner, tired smiles for customers who barely looked at her, counting tips that never seemed to stretch far enough, and then the memory flickered, faint but persistent, of a man sitting alone at the counter 2 nights ago, dressed simply but out of place in a way she could not define at the time, quiet, observant, his eyes lingering just a second longer than most when she refilled his coffee, and she had thought nothing of it then, because men looked, some out of habit, some out of curiosity, and she had learned long ago not to read into it, but now that memory felt different, sharper, as if her mind was trying to reshape it into something meaningful, and she shook her head slightly, pushing the thought away because it felt too convenient, too close to the kind of story that only existed in other people's lives, not hers, and yet the unease remained, settling deeper into her chest, and she moved slowly to the small table by the window, setting the paper down carefully as if it might disappear if she let go too quickly, and outside the city moved on, cars passing, distant sirens blending into the background noise of a place that never paused long enough to notice someone like her, except now, somehow, someone had, and that realization carried a weight she was not prepared for, because being invisible had been painful, but it had also been safe, predictable, and now that safety was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that this was not the end of it, that people like Daniel Hayes did not enter someone's life halfway and leave without a reason, and as Emily stared at the name one more time, her reflection faintly visible in the dark window, she felt it settle into something she could not ignore anymore. This was not random, this was not luck, this was the beginning of something, and she had no idea whether to be grateful for it or afraid. Morning came too quickly, like it always did, slipping through the thin curtains in pale streaks of light that landed across the small apartment and settled on the table where the paper still lay untouched, exactly where Emily had left it the night before, as if it had been waiting for her to wake up and confirm that it was real, not something her exhausted mind had imagined, and for a moment she stayed still on the couch, listening to the quiet breathing of her son from the other room, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of traffic beginning its daily rhythm, all the ordinary sounds that should have grounded her but somehow felt different now, like the world had shifted just slightly out of place, and her eyes moved back to the table, to the name she had tried so hard not to think about, but thinking had been unavoidable. It had followed her into sleep and lingered there, turning simple rest into restless fragments of questions she could not answer, and now in the clarity of morning, the questions felt sharper, more demanding, because daylight did not soften things the way darkness sometimes could. It exposed them, forced them into focus, and Emily pushed herself up slowly, her bare feet brushing against the cool floor as she walked toward the table, each step deliberate, as if closing the distance might somehow change what she would see. But nothing had changed. The receipt was still there, the ink still clear, the name still impossible, Daniel Hayes, and she let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, reaching for the paper again, her fingers steadier this time but her thoughts no less tangled, because now there was a new problem layered on top of everything else. What was she supposed to do with this? Ignore it? Accept it? Question it? None of the options felt right, because each one carried a consequence she could not fully understand, and before she could follow that thought any further, a small voice called from the bedroom, soft and sleepy, pulling her back instantly, "Mom," and just like that, everything else paused, because that voice always came first, always cut through whatever storm was building in her head, and she turned quickly, setting the paper down again as she moved toward the bedroom, pushing the door open gently to find her son sitting up, his hair messy, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and when he saw her, he smiled in that simple, unguarded way that made everything else feel smaller for a moment. "You are up early," he said, his voice still quiet, and Emily returned the smile automatically, sitting beside him and brushing a hand through his hair. "I could not sleep much," she admitted softly, because there was no reason to pretend with him, not about something like that, and he nodded as if that made perfect sense. Children accepting truths without needing explanations, and as she helped him out of bed, moving through the familiar motions of their morning routine, making breakfast, packing his small backpack, checking that he had everything he needed, the rhythm of it all began to settle her slightly, grounding her in the tasks she could control, the small certainties that had always carried them forward. But even in those moments, her mind drifted back, replaying the image of that name again and again, until it became impossible to ignore any longer, and by the time she walked her son down the narrow sidewalk toward the bus stop, the decision had begun to form, quiet but firm, because uncertainty had never been something she could live with for long, not when it involved her child, not when it involved something this far outside her world. And as the bus doors closed and he waved at her through the window, she forced a steady smile, waving back until the bus disappeared down the street, and only then did she let her hand drop, her expression shifting as she stood there alone, the morning air cool against her skin, and for a moment she hesitated, just one moment where turning back felt easier, safer, where she could pretend none of this had happened and continue as she always had. But that moment passed, because something inside her had already changed, something that would not allow her to go back to not knowing, and slowly, she reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as she searched for the name she had only ever seen in passing before, and when the results appeared, confirming what she already knew but had not fully accepted, her breath caught again. Because now it was no longer just a name on paper, it was real, undeniable, and as she stared at the image on the screen, at the man who existed so far beyond her life, one thought settled clearly in her mind: this was not over, not even close. The screen glowed too bright in Emily's hand as she stood there on the sidewalk, the early morning air brushing lightly against her face while the city continued moving around her without noticing the quiet shift happening inside her, and the image on her phone felt almost unreal, a polished photograph of Daniel Hayes standing in a tailored suit, his expression calm, composed, the kind of man who belonged in glass buildings and private meetings, not handwritten notes and anonymous kindness, and yet the name matched perfectly, undeniably, and her thumb hovered just above the screen as if touching it might somehow confirm something deeper, something she was still not ready to accept, and she let out a slow breath, lowering the phone slightly, her mind racing through every detail she could gather from the articles that followed, headlines filled with numbers too large to comprehend, companies she had never heard of, interviews describing him as reserved, strategic, private, a man who rarely appeared in public unless necessary, and that detail alone made her stomach tighten slightly, because people like that did not randomly involve themselves in the lives of strangers, not without purpose, not without intention, and the question pressed harder now, louder than before: why her? What had he seen? What had he noticed that made him step in when no one else ever had? And for a moment she considered the simplest answer, that it was a mistake, some administrative error, a payment meant for someone else that had landed in her life by accident. But that thought fell apart almost immediately, because mistakes did not come with handwritten notes, they did not carry intention, and they certainly did not carry names like his, and she felt that familiar tightening in her chest again, the one that came when something did not fit into the structure she had built her life around, the structure that said everything had a reason, everything had a cost, everything had a balance, and this did not. Not yet, and that imbalance was what she could not ignore, and slowly she slipped the phone back into her bag, her decision settling into place with quiet certainty, because she could not walk away from this, not knowing what stood behind it, not when it involved someone with that kind of power, that kind of reach, and as she turned back toward her apartment building, her steps felt different now, more deliberate, more aware, as if each movement carried weight she had not felt before, and when she reached her door again, she paused briefly, her hand resting against the handle as she gathered her thoughts, because whatever she did next would move this forward, would take something unknown and bring it into her reality, and that meant she needed to be careful, needed to think clearly, and inside, the apartment felt smaller than it had the night before, the walls closer, the air quieter, as if the space itself could sense that something larger was pressing against it from the outside, and Emily moved quickly, picking up the receipt once more, studying the name again, the handwriting, the small details that might give her something more, something she had missed, and then she noticed it, something subtle, almost insignificant at first glance, but enough to catch her attention, a faint impression beneath the ink, as if the note had been written on top of another sheet, leaving a slight mark behind, and she tilted the paper toward the light, narrowing her eyes as she focused, her pulse quickening just slightly as shapes began to form, numbers, not fully clear but enough to suggest something intentional, something left behind without being obvious, and she reached for a pencil from the small drawer by the kitchen, gently shading over the surface the way she had once seen someone do years ago, and slowly, faint outlines appeared, incomplete but readable, a phone number, or at least part of one, and she froze for a second, the pencil still in her hand, because this changed everything. This was not just an act of kindness left to disappear, this was a thread, a way forward, and whoever had written that note had not completely hidden themselves, they had left a choice, a door that could be opened if she decided to step through it, and Emily stared at the numbers, her heart beating a little faster now, not from fear alone but from something else, something closer to resolve, because now she had something real, something she could act on, and as she reached for her phone again, her fingers no longer hesitating the way they had before, one thought settled clearly in her mind, whatever this was, she was not going to stay in the dark anymore. Emily stared at the faint numbers a moment longer, her grip tightening slightly around the pencil as if letting go might cause them to disappear, and the quiet in the apartment felt heavier now, no longer peaceful but expectant, as though everything around her was waiting to see what she would do next, and she swallowed slowly, setting the pencil down beside the paper while her other hand reached for her phone again, this time without hesitation, because uncertainty had already taken enough from her life, and she was not going to let it take this moment too, and as she began carefully entering the numbers, double-checking each one against the faint impressions on the page, her heart beat just a little faster with every digit, not from excitement but from the awareness that she was crossing a line she could not step back from, that whatever existed on the other end of this number would bring answers, and answers always came with consequences, and when she finished, her thumb hovered over the call button for a brief second, the silence stretching just long enough to remind her that she still had a choice, that she could walk away, ignore it, pretend none of this had happened, but that version of herself no longer felt real, not after everything that had already changed, and with a quiet breath, she pressed the button, lifting the phone to her ear as the line began to ring, once, twice, each tone steady and measured, echoing softly in the small kitchen, and she found herself counting without meaning to, her free hand resting against the edge of the counter. As she waited, until finally the ringing stopped, replaced by a brief pause that felt heavier than the sound itself, and then a voice answered, calm, professional, unfamiliar, "Good morning, Hayes corporate office," and Emily froze for just a fraction of a second, the reality of what she had done settling in fully now, because this was not a personal number, not something accidental, this was direct, intentional, connected to the very name she had been trying to understand, and she straightened slightly, her voice quiet but steady as she responded, I am trying to reach Daniel Hayes, and even saying the name out loud felt strange, like stepping into a world she had only observed from a distance, and there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by the same composed tone, May I ask who is calling, and Emily hesitated, not because she did not know her own name, but because saying it here, in this context, felt like it carried more weight than usual, like it would place her somewhere she did not belong. But she forced herself forward. "Emily Carter," she said, her voice softer now, and there was another pause, slightly longer this time, as if something was being checked, verified, considered, and then the voice returned, different now, more attentive. "One moment, please," and the line shifted to silence again, not disconnected, just waiting, and Emily lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the table, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone as she listened to the faint background hum, her thoughts racing through possibilities faster than she could organize them, wondering if he would actually answer, if someone like him would take a call like this, if this entire situation would simply end with a polite dismissal and no explanation, and just as that thought began to settle in, the line clicked softly again, and a different voice came through, deeper, calm, unmistakably controlled. "Emily," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement, and the sound of her name in his voice sent a stillness through her, because it meant one thing she could no longer deny. This was not a mistake, not a coincidence. He knew exactly who she was, and for a moment, she forgot what she had planned to say, her mind going completely blank. As the weight of that realization settled over her, until she finally managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, "Why did you do it?" And there was no accusation in her tone, no anger, only confusion, only the need to understand, and on the other end, there was a pause, not long, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if he was choosing his words carefully, and when he spoke again, his voice remained steady, almost gentle in a way she had not expected. "Because you needed time," he said simply, and the answer hung there between them, quiet, direct, and somehow more overwhelming than anything complicated could have been, and Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, her breath catching as something inside her shifted again, because that answer did not explain everything, but it explained enough to change how she saw this moment. How she saw him, and when she opened her eyes again, staring at the paper still on the table in front of her, she realized that whatever this was, whatever had started between them, it was no longer something distant or abstract, it was real, and it had just begun. Emily held the phone a little tighter against her ear, his words still settling into the quiet space around her, because they were simple, almost too simple for something that had shifted her entire world in a single night, and yet there was something in the way he said them that made it impossible to dismiss, not dramatic, not distant, just certain, as if giving someone time was the most natural thing in the world. And for a moment she did not know how to respond, her mind searching for something that would make sense of it, something that would bring this back into the kind of reality she understood, where actions had clear reasons and people stayed within their place, but nothing about this fit that structure anymore, and she let out a slow breath, her voice steadier now. "You do not even know me," she said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a fact she needed him to acknowledge, and there was a faint shift on the other end of the line. Not hesitation, not discomfort, just a subtle pause, like he was considering how much to say. And when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, measured. "I know enough," he replied, and that answer, instead of resolving anything, only deepened the question, because enough for what? Enough to help, enough to step into her life without asking, enough to make decisions that would have taken her months, maybe years, to recover from on her own, and she glanced down at the receipt again, the ink still dark against the paper, and something inside her tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the need to understand the boundary of this, the shape of it, because if she did not define it, she would be lost inside it, and she straightened in her chair, her voice gaining a quiet firmness. "I cannot accept something like this without knowing why," she said, choosing her words carefully, because gratitude without clarity felt like surrender, and she had spent too long holding her life together to give that up now. And for a second, there was only silence on the line, not empty, but deliberate, like a space he allowed to exist before responding, and when he did, his voice carried something different this time, still calm, but with a weight beneath it. "Then let me explain in person," he said, and the suggestion landed instantly, heavy and unexpected, because this was no longer just a conversation, no longer just a voice on the other end of a phone. This was movement, this was a step closer, and Emily felt her breath catch slightly as her mind raced ahead, picturing what that would mean, stepping into his world, into a place where everything would feel unfamiliar, out of scale, out of balance, and her first instinct was to pull back, to protect the fragile stability she had rebuilt piece by piece. But another thought followed just as quickly, the memory of the note, of the quiet certainty in his voice, of the fact that he had already stepped into her life without asking, and this was her chance. To step forward on her own terms, to take control of something that could easily slip beyond her reach if she let it, and she closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in that thought, before opening them again, her gaze steady even though he could not see it. "Where?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious, and there was no delay this time, no hesitation, as if he had already expected her answer. "There is a cafe on West 48th Street, he said, naming a place she had passed many times but never entered, the kind of place where the windows were always clean and the people inside always seemed unhurried. 10 o'clock, he added simply, and the clarity of it left no room for confusion, no space for negotiation, just an invitation that felt more like a decision waiting to be accepted. And Emily glanced at the small clock on the wall, calculating without meaning to, the time it would take, the shift she would have to adjust, the life she would have to rearrange just enough to make space for this moment. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet resolve that had not been there before. "I will be there," she said, and as the words left her, something inside her settled, not completely, not comfortably, but enough to move forward. And on the other end, there was a brief pause, followed by a single word, "Good," before the line went quiet, the call ending without ceremony, without anything more added, and Emily lowered the phone slowly, staring at it for a moment as if expecting it to explain something further, but it remained still in her hand, just an object again, while everything around her felt different. And as she looked back at the receipt on the table one more time, she realized that whatever answers she had been searching for, she was about to face them, not through paper or voices, but face to face, and there would be no distance left to hide behind when that moment came. Emily did not remember the walk back from the table to the sink, only the sound of the faucet running longer than necessary as she stood there with her hands resting under the stream of water, letting the coolness steady her thoughts while the reality of what she had just agreed to settled in piece by piece, because meeting him was no longer an abstract idea, it had a time, a place, a direction, and that made it real in a way she could not ignore. And she turned off the water slowly, drying her hands with a towel that had seen better days, her eyes drifting around the small apartment as if seeing it differently now, the worn edges of the furniture, the quiet corners, the life she had built with careful effort and constant sacrifice, and for a moment she felt the weight of stepping outside of it, even temporarily, into a world that did not follow the same rules, where problems like hers could be erased with a single decision. And that contrast alone made her chest tighten slightly. Because she did not know how to exist in that kind of space without losing something of herself, and she moved to the bedroom, opening the small closet and scanning what little she had, practical clothes, work uniforms, nothing that belonged in the kind of place he had described, and she paused there, her fingers brushing lightly against a simple blouse she had worn once to a school meeting, something neat, clean, presentable, and she pulled it out slowly, holding it up for a moment as if measuring not just the fabric but the version of herself she would need to be when she walked into that cafe, not someone asking for help, not someone overwhelmed, but someone who could stand across from him and ask questions without losing her voice, and that thought alone brought a quiet determination into her expression, because whatever this meeting became, she would not let it define her. She would not let it turn her into someone who simply received and said thank you without understanding. And as she set the blouse aside carefully, her mind shifted to the practical details again, the time, the distance, the fact that she still had a shift later that afternoon, and she reached for her phone once more, sending a quick message to her manager requesting a slight adjustment, her fingers moving faster now, more certain, because this was something she could control, something she knew how to handle. And when the confirmation came back a few moments later, she let out a small breath of relief she had not realized she was holding, and the clock on the wall ticked forward steadily, each second bringing her closer to 10 o'clock, closer to a moment that felt both inevitable and uncertain at the same time. And she moved through the next hour with quiet efficiency, tidying the apartment, checking the receipt one more time as if it might have changed overnight, placing it carefully into her bag because she knew she would need it, not just as proof but as a reminder of why she was going. And when it was finally time to leave, she paused by the door, her hand resting against the handle just as it had before. But this time the hesitation felt different, not rooted in fear alone, but in the awareness that she was stepping into something that would change the direction of her life, even if she did not yet know how. And she took a slow breath, straightening slightly before opening the door and stepping out into the late morning light, the city brighter now, busier, filled with people moving through their routines without realizing that for her, this day carried a different weight. And as she walked toward the bus stop, her pace steady, her expression calm but focused, one thought remained clear in her mind. This time, she would not be the one being saved without a choice. This time, she was walking forward on her own terms, ready to face whatever waited for her on West 48th Street. The bus ride felt longer than usual, even though Emily had taken this route dozens of times before, the familiar rhythm of stops and starts blending into the background as her thoughts stayed fixed ahead, on the place waiting for her at the end of the line, and she sat near the window with her bag resting firmly on her lap, one hand lightly pressed against it as if to reassure herself that everything she needed was still there, the receipt, the quiet proof that this was not something imagined. And outside, the city shifted gradually, the buildings growing taller, cleaner, the storefronts more polished, until the streets themselves seemed to carry a different kind of energy, one she rarely stepped into, and when the bus finally slowed near West 48th Street she stood before it had fully stopped, her movement steady even as her heartbeat picked up slightly, and stepping down onto the sidewalk, she felt the subtle difference immediately, the air sharper, the noise more controlled, as if even the chaos here followed a certain order she had not learned yet, and she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, glancing down the street until she saw it, the cafe he had mentioned, its glass windows reflecting the late morning light, the inside calm, almost quiet compared to the world outside, and for a moment she remained where she was, just watching, taking in the details, the neatly arranged tables. The people inside dressed in ways that suggested time was not something they worried about the same way she did, and she felt that familiar hesitation rise again, the instinct to turn back, to return to the version of her day that made sense, but it did not hold her this time, not the way it might have before, and instead she took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders slightly, and walked forward, each step measured, deliberate, until she reached the door, and the soft chime as it opened seemed louder than it should have, drawing a brief glance from a few people inside before they returned to their conversations, and Emily stepped in fully, the warmth of the space settling around her, the faint aroma of coffee and fresh pastries filling the air, and she paused just inside, her eye scanning the room carefully, not searching for a face she recognized, because she knew she would not recognize him that easily, but for something that felt out of place, something that did not quite belong to the calm atmosphere around it, and then she saw him, seated near the window, not hidden, not surrounded, just there, as if he had been waiting without urgency, his posture relaxed, his attention not on the room but on the small cup in front of him, and for a second, the image from her phone overlapped with the man in front of her, confirming what she already knew, but seeing it in person made it different, more real, more immediate, and her steps slowed slightly as she moved toward him, aware of the distance closing, aware that this was the moment where everything shifted from questions to answers, and when she reached the table, he looked up, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if this meeting had always been inevitable, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them carrying more weight than words could have, until Emily finally pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, placing her bag carefully at her side, her hands resting lightly on the table as she met his gaze directly, and in that moment, the difference between their worlds felt smaller than it had before, not gone, but less overwhelming, because she was no longer looking up at him from a distance. She was sitting across from him, equal in the space they now shared, and her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, carrying none of the hesitation she had felt earlier. "You said you would explain," she said simply, and he held her gaze for a moment longer before nodding slightly, as if acknowledging not just her words, but the fact that she had come, that she had chosen to be here, and whatever came next would not be something given to her without her consent, but something they would face together, starting now. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence, brief but intentional, seemed to settle over the table like a weight that neither of them rushed to lift, his gaze steady on hers as if measuring something beyond her words, beyond the question itself, and when he finally moved, it was subtle, a small shift of his hand as he set the cup aside, his attention fully on her now. "I told you the truth," he said calmly, his voice even, controlled, but not distant. "You needed time," and Emily felt a flicker of frustration rise at the simplicity of it, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete, because it did not answer the part that mattered most, and she leaned forward slightly, her hand still resting on the table but her posture more engaged now, more certain. "That is not enough," she replied, her tone steady but firm. "People do not do things like that without a reason, not people like you," and there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity, only the refusal to accept something that did not make sense, and Daniel watched her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled again into that same calm composure, and he nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging that she would not let this remain surface level. And then he spoke again, this time with a slight shift in tone, not softer but more direct. 2 nights ago, he began, and Emily felt her focus sharpen instantly, her mind already reaching back to that time, searching, aligning memory with possibility. You were working late, he continued, the diner on 8th Avenue, and the words landed with quiet precision, pulling a clear image into her mind, the long shift, the tired ache in her shoulders, the constant movement between tables, and then she saw it, clearer now, the man at the counter, the one she had almost dismissed entirely, and her breath caught slightly as the memory reshaped itself, details sharpening where they had once been blurred. You stayed past your shift, Daniel went on, his voice steady, not because you were asked to, but because another server left early, and no one else stepped in, and Emily felt a small shift inside her, recognition mixed with something else. Something closer to being seen in a way she was not used to, and she did not interrupt, did not look away, because now she understood that this was not random, not imagined, this had a beginning, and he continued, you had the option to leave, he said, you had already worked 10 hours, but you stayed, and she nodded slightly, almost unconsciously. Because that part was true, it had not felt like a choice at the time, just something that needed to be done, and Daniel's gaze remained steady as he added, then there was a man at the end of the counter, and now the memory sharpened completely, the older man, quiet, tired, counting out coins slowly, carefully, as if each one mattered more than it should have, and Emily felt her chest tighten slightly as she remembered what came next. He did not have enough, Daniel said simply, and Emily's fingers curled slightly against the table as the moment replayed fully in her mind, the hesitation, the quiet embarrassment on the man's face, the way no one else had looked up, and then her own voice, offering without thinking, covering the difference, not because it was easy, but because it felt necessary, and Daniel watched her as that realization settled, not interrupting, not pushing, just letting her arrive at it on her own. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet certainty. You did not ask who he was, he said, you did not expect anything in return, you just helped, and Emily swallowed slowly, her eyes dropping for a brief second before lifting again, because she understood now, not completely, but enough to see the connection forming, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged but his words clearer now. That man was not just a customer, he said, and there was a slight pause, just enough for the weight of what followed to settle. He works for me, and the statement hung there between them, simple, direct, but carrying implications that reached far beyond the diner, beyond that one moment, and Emily felt her breath catch again, not from shock this time, but from the realization of how small actions could travel further than she had ever imagined, and as she looked at him across the table, one thought formed clearly in her mind, this was not about money, not really, it was about something else entirely, something she had given without noticing, and something he had chosen to return in a way she could never have expected. Emily sat very still as his words settled into her, the memory now fully reshaped into something she could no longer dismiss as small or insignificant, and for a moment she looked down at her hands, at the faint lines across her palms, as if trying to understand how something so ordinary, something she had done without thinking, had reached this far, had crossed into a world she had never expected to touch, and when she looked back up at him, her expression had changed slightly, not softer, but deeper, more aware. You paid my rent because of that, she said quietly, not questioning anymore, but confirming, and Daniel held her gaze without hesitation. I paid your rent because you chose to help when no one else did, he replied, his tone steady, as if the distinction mattered, as if it was not about the action itself but the reason behind it, and Emily felt a small shift in her chest again, something she could not quite name, because she had never thought of that moment as something that could carry value beyond itself. It had not been a decision she weighed, it had simply been the right thing to do in that moment. And yet here it was, reflected back to her in a way that made it feel larger, more significant than she had allowed it to be, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, her mind moving through the layers of what he had said, trying to place it somewhere within her understanding of how the world worked, and there was a part of her that resisted it, that wanted to push back against the idea that kindness could return like this, amplified, transformed into something so much bigger, because that was not how her life had ever worked before, and she shook her head slightly, her voice calm but carrying a quiet weight. That was not something special, she said, searching for the right words. It was just what needed to be done, and Daniel's expression shifted just enough to show that he had expected that answer, not dismissing it, not correcting it immediately, but letting it exist for a moment before he responded. That is exactly why it mattered, he said. And the simplicity of his reply cut through her resistance more effectively than anything else could have, because he was not elevating her, not placing her above anything. He was recognizing something she had already believed, something she had lived by without realizing it had value beyond survival, and she felt that realization settle slowly, changing the way she saw not just that moment, but others like it, the small choices she had made without expecting anything in return. And for a second, the distance between their worlds shifted again, not disappearing, but aligning in a way that made this conversation feel less like an imbalance and more like an exchange. And she reached into her bag, pulling out the receipt carefully, placing it on the table between them. The paper now carrying a different weight than it had before. "This is too much," she said, her voice steady, not rejecting it, but acknowledging the scale of it. "I cannot pretend it is not." And Daniel glanced down at the paper briefly before looking back at her, his expression unchanged. "It is enough," he said simply, and there was no arrogance in his tone, no sense of control, just a quiet certainty that made it difficult to argue with. And Emily studied him for a moment, searching for something beneath that calm surface, something that would explain why this mattered to him beyond a single act of kindness, because people did not build lives like his by reacting to moments alone. There had to be something deeper, something that connected this to him in a way she had not yet seen. And as if sensing that unspoken question, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to draw her focus in completely. "The man you helped," he said, "he has worked for me for 23 years. And Emily listened closely, her attention sharpening again as he continued. "He never asks for anything, never complains, not even when he should." And there was a subtle shift in Daniel's tone now, something more personal, less distant. "He told me what you did," he added, not because he wanted recognition, but because he could not understand why you would help him without knowing anything about him. And Emily felt that same tightness in her chest again, not from confusion this time, but from something closer to understanding, because she recognized that perspective. The disbelief that kindness could exist without expectation. And Daniel held her gaze as he finished. "I have built my life around making decisions based on value," he said, "and what you did, that has value." And the words lingered between them, quiet but undeniable, and Emily realized then that this was not about balancing a scale or repaying a debt. It was about something far more simple and far more rare. It was about recognizing something good and choosing not to let it pass unnoticed. And as she sat there, looking at him across the table, she understood that whatever this moment was, it had already changed something in both of their lives, even if neither of them had fully realized how far that change would reach. Emily let his words settle without interrupting this time, not because she had nothing to say, but because something inside her was shifting in a way that required silence to fully take shape. And she found herself looking not at him, but at the small details around them, the light reflecting softly against the glass window, the quiet movement of people passing outside, all continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening, while for her, everything felt slightly altered, as if the boundaries she had always accepted were no longer as fixed as she once believed. And she drew in a slow breath before speaking again, her voice calmer now, less guarded, but still grounded in the reality she knew. "Where I come from," she said, choosing her words carefully, "people do not expect things like this to come back to them." And Daniel listened without interruption, his attention steady, giving her space to continue. "You do what you can, when you can, and then you move on," she added, her gaze returning to him, "because most of the time, nothing comes back." And there was no bitterness in her tone, only honesty, the kind shaped by years of experience rather than disappointment. And Daniel nodded slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood that truth even if it was not one he lived by. And for a moment, the space between them felt balanced in a different way, not divided by wealth or circumstance, but connected by perspective, two different ways of seeing the same world. And Emily rested her hand lightly on the receipt again, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper without thinking. "So this," she said quietly, "feels like more than just returning something." And she let the sentence hang there, unfinished but clear enough, because she was not accusing him of anything, she was asking him to define it, to give shape to something that still felt too large, too undefined. And Daniel did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the window before returning to her, as if he was considering not just her question, but how much of the truth she was ready to hear, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a subtle shift, something more personal than before. "It is more," he said simply, and the clarity of it made her attention sharpen instantly. "Not because of what you did," he continued, "but because of what it reminded me of," and Emily felt a slight pause in her breath, because this was the first time the focus had shifted toward him in a way that suggested there was something behind his actions beyond observation, beyond decision, and she waited, not interrupting, not rushing, because she understood that whatever he was about to say mattered, not just to this moment, but to the reason it existed at all. And Daniel's expression remained composed, but there was a quiet weight beneath it now, something less distant, less controlled. "There was a time," he said, his voice steady but lower, "when I did not have the ability to solve problems with money," and Emily listened closely, her posture still, her focus entirely on him, "and there were people who helped without asking anything in return," he added, and though his tone did not change dramatically, there was something in the way he said it that carried memory, not just fact, and Emily felt a small shift inside her again, something closer to understanding, because this was no longer about her alone. It was about something that had existed before her, something that had shaped him in ways she had not seen. And Daniel continued, "Most of them are gone now," he said, not with sadness, but with quiet acceptance, "and for a long time, I convinced myself that those moments did not matter anymore." And he paused briefly, his gaze steady on hers, "Until I saw you," he finished. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it connected everything in a way she had not expected, not as a transaction, not as a calculated decision, but as a continuation of something unfinished, something he had chosen to carry forward instead of letting it fade. And Emily sat there, absorbing that, her mind no longer searching for reasons in the same way, but understanding now that this was not about balance or fairness, it was about recognition, about seeing something familiar in someone else and choosing to respond to it. And as she looked at him across the table, the distance between them shifted again, not disappearing, but becoming something they could both understand, something that no longer felt out of place. And for the first time since this had begun, Emily felt something settle inside her that was not confusion or hesitation, but clarity, because she finally understood that this moment was not just about what he had given her, it was about what she had unknowingly given him in return, something that could not be measured, but had still found its way back to her in a form she would never forget. Emily did not look away this time when he finished speaking, because something in his words had anchored her in place, not through pressure or expectation, but through a kind of quiet honesty she had not expected to find in someone like him. And for a moment the noise of the cafe seemed to fade just enough for her to focus entirely on what sat between them, not the table, not the receipt, but the understanding that had formed slowly, piece by piece, until it no longer felt like something fragile. And she let out a soft breath, her fingers relaxing slightly where they rested near the edge of the paper, because she realized now that she had been holding on to more than just the situation. She had been holding on to the need to define it, to control it, to make sure it fit within the boundaries she understood, and that need was beginning to loosen, not disappear, but soften in a way that allowed something else to take its place. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that shift. Still grounded, still steady, but no longer guarded in the same way. "Then this is not about fixing a problem," she said quietly, her eyes steady on his, "it is about continuing something." And Daniel's expression changed just slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show that she had understood something important, something he had not said directly, and he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion that confirmed it without needing more words, and Emily felt that confirmation settle inside her, changing the way she saw the moment entirely, because it was no longer about receiving help she had not asked for, it was about standing in the middle of something larger than either of them alone, something that had started before this table, before this conversation, and would continue long after it. And that realization brought with it a different kind of weight, not pressure, but responsibility, because she understood now that how she responded mattered just as much as what he had done. And she glanced down briefly at the receipt again before lifting her gaze back to him, her voice thoughtful now, measured. "I cannot pretend this did not change things for me," she said, and there was no hesitation in that truth. "It did," she added, "in ways I cannot ignore." And Daniel listened without interruption, his attention steady, allowing her to shape her own response without influence. And she continued, "But I also cannot let it define everything that comes next." And that statement carried a quiet firmness, not rejection, but clarity, the kind that came from knowing what she needed to protect, and Daniel nodded again, this time more noticeably, as if he respected that boundary without question, and that reaction, simple as it was, eased something inside her, because it told her that this was not something he intended to control, not something he expected to dictate, and she allowed herself a small pause, just long enough to gather the final piece of what she needed to say, before speaking again. So if this is something that continues, she said, her tone calm but certain, it has to be something I choose to, and the words settled between them with quiet strength, because they were not a condition, not a negotiation, but a statement of presence, of agency, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer before responding, his voice steady, without hesitation. It already is, he said. And the simplicity of that answer carried a depth that did not need to be explained. Because he was not asking her to follow something he had started, he was acknowledging that she had already stepped into it by coming here, by asking, by refusing to remain passive, and Emily felt that settle in fully now, replacing the last remnants of uncertainty with something more grounded, more balanced, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but calm, almost steady, like the pause between steps rather than the space before a fall, and outside, the light shifted slightly against the window, marking the quiet passage of time, and Emily glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to him, her expression no longer searching, no longer questioning, but clear in a way it had not been before, because she understood now that this was not the end of something. It was not even the resolution she had expected to find. It was the beginning of a different kind of path, one she had not planned, but one she had chosen to step onto, and as she reached for the receipt once more, folding it carefully and placing it back into her bag, she realized that it no longer felt like a burden or a mystery. It felt like a marker, a point she could look back on and recognize as the moment everything quietly shifted, not because someone saved her, but because she allowed herself to be seen, and chose to respond in return. Emily stepped out of the cafe a few minutes later, the soft chime of the door fading behind her as the city sound returned in full, steady and familiar, but something inside her no longer matched the rhythm she had walked in with, and she paused on the sidewalk for just a moment, not because she was unsure of where to go, but because she was aware that something quiet yet irreversible had settled into place, something that would not announce itself loudly, would not demand attention, but would remain, shaping the way she moved forward from here, and she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her fingers brushing lightly against the folded receipt inside, not as a reminder of what she had received, but of what had been recognized, and that difference mattered more than she expected, because for so long her life had been defined by what she lacked, what she needed to fix, what she had to endure, and now, for the first time in a long while, something had reflected back to her what she already had, something she had never thought to measure, never thought to value beyond the moment it existed in, and she began walking, her pace steady, her gaze forward, the streets no longer feeling as distant or overwhelming as they had earlier that morning, because she was not stepping back into the same version of her life she had left, she was stepping forward with a clearer understanding of it, and that clarity did not change her circumstances overnight. It did not erase the long shifts, the careful budgeting, the constant balancing of responsibility, but it changed how those things felt, how they sat within her, and as she reached the corner, waiting briefly for the light to change, she found herself thinking not about what would come next in some distant, uncertain future, but about the immediate steps she would take, picking up her son from school, preparing for her shift, continuing the life she had built, because that life was still hers, still something she had created with effort and intention, and nothing about this moment had taken that away from her. If anything, it had reinforced it, had shown her that the small choices she made, the quiet decisions no one noticed, carried more weight than she had allowed herself to believe, and when the light changed, she crossed the street with the same steady pace, blending back into the movement of the city, no longer standing apart from it, and somewhere behind her, inside the cafe, Daniel remained at the table for a while longer, his gaze resting briefly on the space she had just occupied, not with expectation, not with control, but with a quiet understanding that what had begun there did not belong to him alone. It never had, and as Emily disappeared into the flow of people, the distance between their worlds remained, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a bridge that had been built not through grand gestures, but through a single moment of kindness that neither of them had planned, and that was what made it real, what made it lasting, because it had not been created by power or need, but by something far simpler and far stronger, the choice to see someone when it would have been easier not to, And as Emily continued walking, one thought settled gently into place, not as a conclusion, but as something that would stay with her long after this day had passed. He had the power to change her life in an instant, but what he gave her instead was something she would carry much further, the certainty that what she did, even when no one was watching, still mattered, and always would.